So let's get started with this talk. For those of you that weren't here yesterday for my talk, let me give a quick introduction. I'm the CTO at my own independent cybersecurity research company, Zero IT Lab. I'm also a member at Budapest University of Technology's Crisis Lab and our CTF team, CoreDump. Personally, I do a lot of reverse engineering work. It's the domain in which I'm the most active for sure. This is my title for the Describe Your Job Poorly contest. I love to open expensive calculators, and today I finally get to show one of those expensive calculators. I mentioned our CTF team. For those of you that aren't familiar with Capture the Flags, they're a very hands-on way of learning IT security and practicing your skills, so hugely recommend it for anyone who likes to learn about this sort of stuff. So let's get started with our material for the day. Cybersecurity challenges and risks. Whenever I'm thinking of a risk in IT security, the two factors I'm definitely considering are the likeliness of a vulnerability being exploited and the impact. What's the consequence when something gets exploited? Those are the two main factors I tend to think of when it comes to risk. But what type of risk are we considering, really? I like to list these four categories of risk. So I'm sure they are mostly self-explanatory at this point. The one of these four that interests me the most is technological vulnerabilities in hardware and software. Obviously, it's a very broad area, so there's a lot of research and activity there. I think this one's the one with the most technical depth compared to the other three. So I'll talk a bit about how organizations and businesses can manage their risk in this fourth area, technological vulnerabilities. So whenever you're thinking of managing a risk, penetration testing is a practice that may come to your mind. It's pretty much an industry standard thing to do. I don't think I need to introduce this practice to any of you, right? But I don't think there's a lot of discussion around how you're supposed to do penetration testing and how you can actually do it correctly and get the most value out of your time and investment. So that's the first thing I want to talk to you a bit about today. So during my experience in the industry, I've often seen basically the fact that an organization just wants to get through an audit, basically tick all the checkboxes, make sure no one's coming after them for not getting some auditing thing done, and they just want to get on with their business. So that's a type of non-security that I think is common. So it's very important to consider when you're thinking of penetration testing, is this something I really want, or is this just another checkbox on my list? So once you decide if you really need real-world hacking, you have a fair starting point for choosing your theme for the test and thinking about the other factors that go into that choice. So the obvious next question is, how do you choose a team for penetration testing, right? You might think, okay, I want someone who's really competent, who knows their craft, who's going to find the most vulnerabilities possible. Maybe you can look at their track record, right? But on the other hand, choosing a team is very often a compromise between price and competence. You can get a really good team for a high price. Not necessarily all teams that cost a lot of money are good. So you have to have a budget if you want to get a chance, a remote chance, at even getting someone competent. So, like I said, not everyone who charges a lot is good, but you're very unlikely to get someone who is good for, well, a really small amount of money. I mean, of course, this is relative in each case and specific to that system, but in any case, I think that's something you should keep in mind. Also, during my years in the industry, I've often had this conversation when someone would want you to find all the vulnerabilities possible in their system. And they would want you to do this with a 0% chance of creating denial of service in their system. And I have to tell you, this is the magical unicorn that doesn't exist. If you want a good test, shit might go down. That's how it works. So if you want good testing, make sure your environment is suitable for the conditions that are required for good testing. So I'm mentioning this because if someone, a penetration tester, comes in and promises you any of these things, you can already suspect that they're sort of bullshit. They cannot promise you any of these, so keep an eye on that. So let's say you eventually get a penetration testing team to look at one of your products or services, right? Make sure that they actually have what they need to work, right? So, like I said, these options of like not having an actual testing environment or saying that denial of service is a non-option, this is a very strong inhibitor for good testing. So if you actually decide to spend money on penetration testing, make sure you get good value out of it and provide the environment for the people to actually be able to do their work. And also, issues often come up during testing. Make sure to have competent people on hand who are able to assist the testers. If you don't do any of these, obviously time's gonna go by, you'll pay for the penetration testing, but you're burning your own money because you're not getting adequate value out of the testing. So, about the price. A good team, like I said, is always going to cost you. And you should not be trying to minimize your costs on the expense of getting a good penetration testing team. The way you make sure your testing is efficient is by getting the highest value out of a good team that's going to cost you money. So the very first step that I would recommend to anyone in terms of getting good value out of their penetration tests is make sure you choose the right team. And then, of course, each and every time I recommend this, from the other side of the table comes a response. How would I know who's the right team? Of course, people who are not that technical are the ones asking this question more often. But let me suggest a few ways in which you can try to tackle this question. But before we do that, I have to warn you of a very common bias, a cognitive bias that people who choose penetration testing teams may have, which is that in a lot of organizations, the person who's in charge of choosing a penetration testing team might be held accountable, not only for any issues that may come up during the incident, but also for any future issues that may come up after the test has been done. You know, why haven't the team found this specific issue or that issue? Like these sort of discussions is what I really mean. So there's this bias from the people who are choosing the penetration testers to pick someone who has brand recognition, usually a multinational corporation or advising company, or advisors, I mean, whose services are varying in quality. I mean, I don't mean that specifically for advisors, but in general, usually once you have a really big company, they move slow and they might not have that specific competence or that specific skill that would be needed to efficiently penetration test your specific product. So you might turn to certifications. Well, you would think it's a good thing to choose someone who's certified, right? That's literally what certificates are for. But instead of that, let me suggest alternative options that you may have. Here's a few of them which are technical, and a few, I mean, 1.5, that's not technical. Obviously, not everyone who's going to choose a penetration testing team is going to be a very technical person. So for those of you that aren't that technical, go with the non-technical options. So option 1, go actually meet them. Meet the penetration testing team, I mean. And not the C-level executives who employ them, but the actual team. If you have a chance, if that's something possible, you should always do. Go meet the team, talk to them, see how good they are at their craft. It's a technical thing to do. Obviously, it's a technical assessment, but if that's something that you can do, you should definitely do. The second option I have for you is both technical and a bit non-technical. Checking out their publications, blogs, Twitter, etc. It's slightly technical because if you have to judge their publications or blogs, which are often technical materials, you need some technical skills, but you can also look at their reputation, how they're interacting with other people in the industry. That's a much less technical thing. And here's an absolutely non-technical way. You can just check if they're competing in CTFs. If someone is in the top 100 or top 50 on CTF time, that's not necessarily like a sure indication of them being like excellent at penetration testing, but I think there's a very strong correlation. If they're good at solving CTF problems, they're very likely good at thinking outside the box, which means they are much more likely to be good penetration testers and find the issues that are hidden in your system. Back to certifications a bit. These are the ones I've been able to find in about 2 minutes. There's a lot of them, right? So are any of it worth your time? Are any of these good for choosing someone? The answer may surprise you. So, as a tester or a researcher, you can spend all the money in the world on these certificates, and obviously they cost your time and your effort. I'm personally not a fan of this practice. I have friends who have a lot of these certificates, and we often discuss their experience with acquiring these and getting through the challenge courses. And one of the examples I got from them is that they had to write shell code for Windows Server 2002. Yet they were asking me, hey, how does the credential struct work on Linux? Which, I mean, is a fair question, but I would want a well-known certificate to cover these materials. Why are the course materials so out of date in some cases? So the conclusion I'm trying to get to is at the end of the day, holding these certificates doesn't prove what you should be really looking for in a penetration tester. Any technical skill beyond what that specific certificate is covering is largely unknown to you. Just because someone has an OSCP or whatever, that doesn't tell you if they're curious, really, about the industry, if they've got any insight into information security as a whole, or if they have the willingness or capacity to adapt on the fly when something goes in an unexpected way during a test. And like I mentioned before, it also doesn't show if they're capable of thinking outside the box, which is a very crucial skill. So I'm not trying to say that anyone who has these certifications is not good at the things listed. I'm just saying that the certificate doesn't prove these things. There may be a correlation between the desired skills and having a certification, but correlation is not causation, and you should remember that. So, Changing gears a bit, I want to talk about the public relations, both from the public's and an organizational perspective. One value that's sort of driving economy, not only in the Western world, is the concept of maximizing shareholder value. It's really important. There's even legal precedent under eBay versus Newman, where the law made it literal malfeasance for a company not to do everything it's legally able to maximize its profits. So this is going to be our core starting point for our next thoughts regarding the public relations and how disclosures happen. So, with this thought in mind, maximizing shareholder value, this pretty much means that if a company is not legally required to disclose a vulnerability to you, and they understand that disclosing something is going to have public backlash, right? People are going to be raged out about this vulnerability or that credential leak or whatever. This means that they know that their perception, maybe their stock, is at risk. So with the maximizing shareholder value concept in mind, they are definitely not going to disclose a vulnerability if it's not going to maximize shareholder value. It's kind of sad, really, but that's the reality of it. So I want to give a piece of advice to consumers. How do we create good culture around disclosures? Well, I made a be outraged and a don't be outraged list so that we can create good culture around disclosures. So here's my please do not be outraged list. If a company is willingly deciding to share information with you about any vulnerability they had in their system or service, and they were not legally required to disclose it to you, make sure to show your appreciation to them. They are doing a service to you that they are not required to do. It's a really good thing. Also, you should remember, unfortunately, software is shit. I mean, not all software, there's obviously varying degrees of being shit, but very often software is vulnerable, and you should not be expecting software to be perfectly secure, because that's not really a goal that's like fully attainable today. So instead, I would suggest that whenever a disclosure happens, you should judge the attitude of the organization and the mitigation response procedure that they've taken to address whatever was being disclosed, and only the technological vulnerability second. Because looking at their attitude and their procedure tells you a lot more about how they perceive this area and how mature they are. So I suggest looking at these things first and only then judging the actual vulnerability. Hope it makes sense. But here's my please do be outraged list. You could be asking, why does this make sense, right? Well, I think customer pushback and consumer pushback is what's essentially forming how companies approach this area. So by giving feedback, I mean, maybe being outraged is a bit of an overstep, but actually giving constructive feedback is going to influence this culture in a good way. So when a company refuses to be transparent and refuses to release information to you that concerns you, obviously, maybe if your credentials have been leaked or if their software was vulnerable in a major way, this is something that you would want to know about. If they refuse to tell you, make sure you make yourself heard and give them feedback about what's okay and what's not. Some companies take legal action against security researchers. Make sure you tell them, this is bullshit, don't do this. And then some companies, when vulnerabilities are found in their products and services, release ineffective or defective fixes to the issues. I'll show you an example of how outrageous this can get. So once again, give feedback when it's appropriate. Some companies operate with very anti-competitive practices. The triple E stands for Embrace, Extend, Extinguish. If you haven't heard of this, look it up. Some companies are still doing this today. Vote with your wallet. Don't buy their shit. Those companies that offer products that take away your fundamental freedoms of computing in key areas, by which I mean networking gear, operating systems, firmware that runs on like the very hardware that you use. Those are core areas where you should be very strongly driving innovation towards free software, because free software and ownership is what allows you to defend yourself and level the playing field against offensive actors. Yeah, about bullshit fixes. Let me just show you this one. This was in one of Cisco's products. A researcher submitted an issue. Their proof of concept exploit used the well-known application curl, and their fix or firmware update contained this line of code in their Nginx configuration file. In case you're not familiar with this sort of syntax, the code means if the user agent is curl, meaning the curl application is being used to interact with this device, this would return an HTTP 403 instead of the site. So it literally just breaks the proof of concept and doesn't fix any of the issues that were revealed by the exploit. So I don't get how you can get to the level of being a company like Cisco and still afford to do this. This is not right. Make sure you make yourself heard. You should not accept this sort of behavior. Okay, once again, let me change gears a bit. Let's talk about bug bounties. I'm a bit conflicted on this. It certainly has its advantages and disadvantages. Let's look at both, right? So some companies basically try to minimize their costs. So whenever they were thinking of like getting a penetration testing team, they can just go to a bug bounty provider and be like, hey, we're not going to pay for issues, but here's our program, and source those vulnerabilities. So, I mean, this is fortunately the exception rather than the rule. But as a researcher, doing bug bounties can be a scam. I'll elaborate. So what I mean is that if you're not smart about it, if you work for the wrong people, if you work for a program that doesn't pay what your vulnerabilities are worth, that's an issue. So don't work for people that don't appreciate your work, both with their response times, obviously the contents of their response, their attitude, and of course in the financial aspect as well. They have to pay good money for good vulnerabilities. Don't sell yourself short. But if you're smart about doing bug bounties, you can get a really good return on your investment. So my advice is that if you're looking to do bug bounties, make sure you're smart about it, make sure you work for the right people. Otherwise, you don't get a good return. So this opening slide sounded a bit negative, but don't get me wrong. I love a fair number of things about bug bounties. They do tremendous good in the world. So let me tell you about a few of those tremendously good things. Obviously, you're directly sourcing vulnerability information to a vendor, meaning they'll fix the issue and users are not going to be impacted. It definitely provides a way of life or a source of income for freelancer researchers, which is something that fits some people's lifestyles. Having an option like this is surely welcome. It also paved the way for the decriminalization of security research. Obviously, 10 or 20 years ago, we did not have this bug bounty culture even in the West. So by actually creating these programs and accepting the vulnerability information, the bug bounty platforms definitely created good culture around responsible disclosure. Like I mentioned for the first point here, through bug bounties, a lot of bugs get fixed before they would impact you. So it's definitely good for consumers and their privacy and security. There's no doubt about that. And this slogan, "Together we hit harder," comes from one of the bug bounty platforms, HackerOne. Basically, the argument being the knowledge is being crowdsourced. Whoever is the most competent and most, well, they have the best craft in that specific area, is able to deliver value directly to the programs that are impacted by their research or their specific craft. So I really like this thought because it only takes one individual with a specific skill to bring gigantic value to a much larger crowd of people. So these are my positive thoughts about bug bounties. They're hugely positive in these areas. Let's look at this from an organizational perspective. When should you do bug bounties? Let's say you're the security manager for your organization. Maybe you're thinking, do we do bug bounties? When do we do them? How do we do them? So my advice to you would be, once your product or service is mature enough, maybe it has undergone at least one penetration test, you should always do bug bounties. And then when I tell this to people, of course, one of the reactions I get is, oh, I don't have the budget for this. Well, you can start small. Obviously, if you don't pay right, the quality researchers are not going to work for you. But still, even without the top 5% or top 10% of researchers, you can still get very good value and very good vulnerabilities. So even if you're starting out with a lower budget, this is worth doing. But I have to warn you, the 3 things you have to get right if you want to do a bug bounty as an organization is defining your budget. Make sure you know roughly how much you can spend on this, and define your scope and the respective payouts such that your budget is not going to be inadequate for paying researchers. And also keep in mind that whenever you get issues regarding your service, you have to allocate resources to fix this. So make sure that the people who are going to triage the bugs are available to triage them. So if setting this up is not in your core competence, which is very rarely the case for an organization, get external help. Talk to researchers or companies like us, because we can help you to find the right options in these 3 areas. So this was roughly the main point I was trying to make for an organization. But also here's a warning. Hacker culture really is the immune system of the internet. Good hackers protect everyone. So respect the culture and contribute it by getting those 3 things right. And don't be one of those people. You can see the colors. This seems like a hidden message, right? This refers to telecom, the Hungarian telecom. Yes. Okay. Make sure we get this right. So, let me tell you a hugely impactful story in my life about bug bounties. Hopefully I can give you some insights into how valuable bug bounty is when it's done right. So, Riot Games is a company founded in 2006, headquartered in West LA, and they are a video game production and publishing company with, I think in 2018, they had 24 offices around the globe, and they're best known for their hugely popular title, League of Legends. And just recently, they finally put the S in Riot Games by announcing a range of new titles, which I'm personally very excited about. As for player counts or their popularity, Recent numbers are harder to come by, but during my short research, I was definitely able to find references saying they had over 100 million monthly active players on their platform in 2016. And they're one of the more transparent companies, which I definitely appreciate. They have a tech blog on which they released an article in 2016 titled Running a Bug Bounty Program. And they outlined 5 important points to how they want to do bug bounties. And if you look at them, this largely covers what I told you about how you should do bug bounties. Fight together and not with the researchers, obviously. Make sure the researchers are awarded and they feel like part of your team. After all, you're working for the same cause. Keep it simple and stupid so that they understand where your limits are. And value the researchers' time by paying them what their research is worth. That's how you build a world-class program that attracts the best people. And they know that too, which is great. So, let me talk to you a bit about how their product works. League of Legends is their main title, and it's powered by a piece of software called the League Client, also very often referred to as LCU, which stands for League Client Update because it's their reworked client, whatever. This piece of software mainly works using 2 processes. One of them is a C++-based hosting engine that sort of hosts microservices in this backend process, and they're available through a RESTful API that is provided over HTTPS locally. And this C++-based backend process spawns a sort of front-end process titled UX, which is a Chromium-based browser, essentially. And this browser process is pointed at the backend process, and that RESTful API is what serves all the requests and does the fancy backend processing so they can focus on building the front end using HTML5 and JavaScript and the usual stuff. Both of the back and the front-end process is powered by a plugin system, so every component that appears on your screen or that presents themselves as a microservice is an individual module or a plugin in their system. This is how their client looks like. This is a bunch of plugins working together, so you get a really put together, great-looking experience with the added benefit and modularity of their plugin system. It's a good design, I think. This is how they visualize this sort of like plugin system in their ecosystem. So they're saying there's a Riot data center which runs their platform code. They connect to that using a protocol called RTMP. And the RTMP client is actually the C++ microservice part and the backend process. And the backend plugins are what are essentially offering this piece of functionality to the front end via the RESTful API. One of the features that a lot of people were excited about, titled Clash, was a really interesting addition to League of Legends. Basically, they wanted the players to feel like professional players in the sense that they've tried creating aspects of professional play into the normal League of Legends experience that people could reach. So this was a very sought-after addition to their game. So it was a bit rushed out, and I'm going to show you a few vulnerabilities in this subsystem and how we leverage that for a hugely impactful exploit chain. So the first vulnerability was a traditional cross-site scripting in the client. So this was the dialogue that you got if you got invited to one of those Clash teams on League of Legends. One of the very first things we tested was like, what if we put HTML code there? And to our surprise, the image tag got rendered. This is the name of the team we made, just like a broken image tag. and it showed up in the remote client's dialog. So we knew we were onto something. But there are two issues we had to overcome. The first is that this toast dialog doesn't trigger JavaScript execution if you put a normal script tag there, because they're using the append child JavaScript function internally, which doesn't pop JavaScript code execution in the script tags. The other issue we had is that the front end limited the length of the team name, so our payloads had to be relatively short. Luckily, we were able to overcome both issues. The local API endpoint that was provided by the C++ microservice did not limit the length. That was only a check on the front end part. So using the local API endpoint, we could push a payload with arbitrary length. And we also figured out a way to pop JavaScript code execution from the element that's appended into the toast dialog. So we used an image tag with an invalid source, namely just the letter A, which is obviously invalid, and we assigned an onError attribute to this image tag. So whenever this image tag is rendered in Chrome, it's broken, which means the onError attribute is triggered and this piece of code is called. So now we could create a script element from the onError attribute and load external JavaScript, which is then appended to the document's body, and then we have clean JavaScript code execution in a remote client instance. You can see the host : part of this payload. I'll describe that in more detail in a bit. So where do we go from there? The backend provided an API call named exit and run. Very practical for us, I can tell you. So we were thinking, oh wait, I'll explain why they have this here in the client in the first place. So when they were transitioning from their old client to this revert client, for a while they were offering the option to players to go back to the old client in case they did not like the new one. And this transition back to the old client happened using this API call. So whenever you clicked, hey, I want to go back to the old client, this API call was used to pop the old exe. But here in this case, we are free to call an arbitrary local executable with arguments of our choosing. So I'm thinking, is there a standard executable that's at the same place on each basic Windows install that's going to allow us to execute code? And conveniently, there is. With cmd.exe, you can use the /c command line argument to execute any batch commands. So if you use these parameters for this API call, you get arbitrary code execution via the local command interpreter. So that was our plan. We're going to make a Clash team, use this payload to trigger JavaScript code execution in the remote client, and then we'll use this API call, like shown, to pop the local cmd.exe, and then from there we wanted to jump to PowerShell just so we have a nicer time and do whatever from there. So this is the time for a demo. I'll show you how it goes. So this is our company. And here's our proof of concept exploit. So what you can see on the left, the left side is cut off, but whatever, bear with me. What you can see on the left is our exploit application. All you had to do was input the summoner name of someone who's logged on to League of Legends. And here's a client that we have open on the same computer. What we'll do is that we'll type the name of this person who's logged on, and we'll just press the big exploit button, and the remote shell pops. And then from there, we can just pop our favorite expensive calculator. Thank you. So just to recap, what did just happen, right? So at first, I'm not sure if I'll be able to catch this live, but once you press the exploit button, this will send an invite to a Clash team. A dialog is going to show up here. Yeah, it's pretty quick. That dialog shows the broken image tag, which then triggers the onerror attribute that then calls our external JavaScript, which is included into their UX Chromium instance. Then it calls this function that's provided by the backend called exit and run, which is going to pop CMD with the argument of our choosing, which is then going to pop PowerShell, which is going to send a reverse shell to this application. Let me explain the host and port part of this payload. So we were thinking, how do we actually control where the reverse shell goes? So we figured we could include the address of the computer where we want to receive the reverse shell in the team's name. And the JavaScript code that's calling the exit and run API call takes this part of the URL where the JavaScript was loaded from and puts those parameters into our reverse shell code that's executed by the PowerShell interpreter. So that's how we control where the PowerShell goes to. And that's what you can also see on the demonstration. That's also pretty quick. But a PowerShell instance also pops right here. That quick flash of a window, that was the PowerShell interpreter being executed by CMD. So, about this story, the mitigation for all of the issues mentioned was deployed globally in less than 8 hours, both for the client-side issue and the server-side issue, by which I mean checking the length of the team on the server side. So here's what I've just told you about judging companies. That comes in big time. Look at their procedure. Their procedure is on point. Even if the code is a bit silly, their procedure of handling this issue is very good. They operate a lot of shards globally, a lot of regions for League of Legends, and having this sort of response is more than impressive. So huge props to them. This became the largest payout in Riot's bug bounty history. You can probably see why. So I felt this was a good showcase of the fact that impact is not directly tied to technical complexity. Well, this was an exploit chain, but the issues that were used were not incredibly complex. So that's something you should keep in mind. You don't necessarily always need a ROP chain with 500 gadgets to do something cool. So the point I was trying to make the whole time is Riot was able to protect its players specifically because people have been thinking smart about bug bounty programs there. So we were able to find this before Black Hats do and provide this huge value to Riot and the players because they know how to do this right. So I encourage those of you that are in charge of, or maybe in charge of doing something like this at your organization, to learn from their example and be smart about how you do bug bounties. We're close to the end. I'd like to give a quick shout out to two of my fellow researchers who helped me with this research and a lot of other stuff. Here's their contacts in case you're curious. They're very clever people who I love working with, and I appreciate them very much. You can take a photo if you want to look at their stuff. And last but not least, here are our contacts. On the left, you can see my Twitter. My DMs are open. Get in touch if you'd like to have a conversation. I'm very open in that regards. Here's our company. We provide a range of services, including consulting and penetration testing. If what you've seen today seems impressive, we can help you in other areas probably. And our CTF team, CoreDump, is also on Twitter. You can give us a follow and stay up to date on our CTF contests and results. I've also brought some merchandise stuff here to the venue, so be on the lookout for water bottles and webcam covers with our brand, Zero IT Lab. Thanks very much for listening.